Okay, so in this presentation, we're going to look at the series of movements, the counterculture type movements, and other kind of fringe minority movements that were occurring in the 1960s. These are very important because this is a lot of AP material. AP exams usually tend to focus on a lot of these kind of minority movements, these counterculture movements that are happening. So you need to really make sure that you look this one over closely, take very good notes on it, especially from your readings, that sort of thing. So first off, there is going to be a resurgence of Native American protests in the 1960s. And in fact, what happens is it gets more militant in terms of how they protest against the federal government. Remember, we talked about under Eisenhower, you had kind of the termination program, and it didn't work very well. Tribal autonomy was once again kind of under attack. And so what's happening is as these termination programs are trying to get natives to assimilate, of course, what you'll see is kind of a bucking against that. And what they do is there's all these federal buildings on the reservations, and so the Native Americans begin occupying these federal buildings. They're going to begin going onto land that they claim the federal government took from them through a lot of these treaties. And basically, what they're doing is they're almost like staging, like I guess you could almost say like sit-ins. They're occupying the land, kind of what we saw in Oregon recently. Um, and they're going to some of them have firearms and weapons and stuff with them. Of course, we talked about this in class, but Alcatraz becomes one of the more like high-profile places that they actually occupy. Um, and you'll also have what are known as survival schools, and these were teaching Indian history. The goal was to preserve culture, and so these schools were basically teaching younger Indians heritage culture, so that way they could retain it. Those are Indians there you can see on Alcatraz Island and in the cells. You can see on the right there's a guy with the film camera. I think there was a documentary that was made about it as it was happening. You're also going to see Latino protests. Cesar Chavez and Dolores Huerta are going to be very important. You definitely need to know who both of them are and what their contribution to the Latino movement was. And they're going to be demonstrating on behalf of migrant workers. So people who are working in like California, uh, Arizona, a lot of people working on like citrus farms, that sort of thing. And these workers, of course, as we talked about, pretty much were used and abused because a lot of them were over here on certain programs, so they had visas. And if you protested your treatment or how much you were being paid, then it was very easy for an employer just to say, well, you can either take it or I can deport you back and say you're violating your visa. And so Cesar Chavez and Dolores Huerta are going to help protest on behalf of these people. They founded what becomes known as the United Farm Workers, and this was basically a union of migrant and agricultural workers, a lot of them Latino, to help them basically have a voice and to try and protest their treatment and how they were being paid and that sort of thing. Also, part of their movement is they call for a national boycott of California grapes. And this actually works. People do it. And this helps them get wage increases in 1970. And so this is very important. And so, like I said, please make sure you remember Cesar Chavez, Dolores Huerta, UFW, and kind of what they did, why it was important. And there's Cesar and Dolores. Okay, the other one is, and this is what you all are probably more familiar with from the 1960s, is going to be the Students for a Democratic Society. This is a group that formed in 1960, and it was kind of a counterculture socialist student organization. Mostly found, you have them organizing on college campuses, and they are going to protest actions taken by the federal government, especially against the Vietnam War. And you'll see massive protests. For instance, you have University of California, Berkeley, where the university pretty much says that the students are not allowed to organize and set up these tables to recruit for these kind of counterculture groups. And the students say this is a violation of free speech, and therefore they begin these huge protests in Berkeley, which become very famous. The other thing too here is these are the baby boomers, and these are kids who, basically had it pretty easy growing up for the most part. Didn't have to want for a whole lot, and that's what kind of gives them this ability to attack the system, because it's not like we've seen with other movements where, like if you were black, or for instance, sometimes you were more concerned with feeding your family, making, getting a paycheck. And so this group, they don't really have that to worry about. And so this gives them kind of the luxury to organize and come together and, go against the system. But of course, the irony of it is that, this is the system that is kind of making what they're doing possible. And what will happen is you'll see coming out of this the group we call the hippies. And these were kind of the new evolution of the Beat generation. They rejected mainstream values. They didn't like this whole, 9 to 5, Monday through Friday work day. They thought it was basically draining the life out of people. The monotony of it. Everybody looked the same. Everybody did the same thing. They also go against materialism, just like the Beat generation did. They say that the rationality and the order that has been kind of purveyed on us from the federal government is baloney. And of course, this movement is about kind of free thinking and experimentation. A lot of that will be with drugs. You'll also have this kind of free love movement, which was about sexual control and arguing that society and people, the government, were controlling your sexual behavior, and that you should essentially be able to have sexual freedom with whomever you wanted to. And what kind of embodied their movement was the rock and the folk music that came out during the 1960s. So you had like Bob Dylan, who was a very popular folk singer among this movement. You're also going to see a lot of countercultural type rock and roll. You're going to have Purple Haze by Jimi Hendrix. And Jimi Hendrix, of course, becomes very popular during Woodstock, where he basically plays this kind of radical version of the national anthem. And it was kind of more of like, it was seen as being fairly disrespectful, but of course for this movement, it was on purpose. When we get to Vietnam, we're going to talk a little bit more about how music played a very important role in this. But by the time the early 70s roll around, hippies have kind of faded away. The movement is very short-lived. But a lot of stuff that comes out of the movement, we still have. For instance, rock music and the type of music that we get from this counterculture movement continues, and I would say has almost it's become more popular again. We're kind of going back into this kind of folk/rock music again. Also, jeans, which were very popular among the counterculture movement. Long hair for males also was very popular during the counterculture movement, and once again, you still kind of see that kind of pervade into the time period. And for a while there, it was almost like long hair was coming back in the 2000s, but I feel like now we're almost kind of going back. You see hairstyles mimicking more of the early 60s and the 1950s, kind of the short and tight cut for males on the side, but then a little longer on top. The other thing that's going to happen in the 1960s is an environmental movement. And we talked about how under Johnson, you're going to start to see the government take more action here. What we're going to see is, first off, a huge movement against pesticides, using chemicals for agriculture. We talked about kind of, you see these bald eagles, which was a symbol of the country, and they were laying these eggs that had these very thin shells, and so the eagles were dying out. And a lot of this was because of pesticides that were being used on farm fields. It was being washed away into streams, and then fish were getting infected, and then the eagles were eating the fish, and they were getting infected. And so in 1962, Rachel Carson, and I know some of you are familiar with this from your environmental science course, she writes a book called Silent Spring, and she discusses how harmful pesticides and chemicals and DDT was. And this really opens eyes to a lot of people that we need to be more protectful of the environment. We need to kind of take our role a little more seriously as people to kind of take care of the animals and just kind of take care of the environment in general. Um, and under Johnson, you'll see some action, but really, Richard Nixon is going to work very hard to pass legislation that protects the environment. You get the Environmental Protection Agency, and you also get the Occupational Safety and Health Act, OSHA, and then the Clean Air Act of 1970. And so these put restrictions on chemicals that could be used in the workplace. Factories had to be careful about emissions that they were putting out, and they had to, some of them, spend fairly large sums of money to kind of overhaul some of their factories to make sure that they weren't emitting chemicals that were harmful to the environment. And then the EPA, of course, was created to oversee a lot of this and to make sure that people that worked in these kind of industries were doing whatever they could to try and stay within environmental regulations.